Got our
Hey,
bubbly
quick
drinks.
note about the French 75.
Yeah.
Because I'm enjoying the, thank you for adding the botanicals with those bitters. This is a wonderfully subtle drink. Subtle in my opinion. I mean, I like strong drinks. I just think it's funny the origin story that um, the combination. So I'm just reading from Wikipedia. The combination was said to have such a kick that it felt like being shelled with the powerful French 75 millimeter field gun. Hence the name French 75.
Wow. And to think, well, I wonder if that's now. What year did it say that it was invented?
Uh, 1915 that this drink was invented, and whoa, feels like I'm being shelled by 1915 World War One era weaponry. Um, have drinks gotten
Weaker.
stronger or weaker as
Well,
the century has passed?
the one reason that I actually asked about when it was created was similar to our discussion on absinthe a few was that a couple of shows ago, and it's my only guess is this because no, I don't think that they've gotten necessarily weaker. I think cocktails have become more balanced. There is a more standard level of measurement that's happening right now. But like we talked about back to the absinthe, like we talked about absinthe from that era, and why it was thought to that wormwood was poisonous or wormwood was causing people to hallucinate, when really it was the poor quality, high alcohol gins or vodkas, the bathtub gins that were being created and made back then at that time. So if you were drinking 180 proof alcohol, I mean, John, if we were just drinking 151 by itself, get wrecked pretty fast. If I were to start drinking Everclear, you're actually slightly melting your brain, and that's what they found out that all the writers that were drinking 180
Hmm.
proof alcohol back then. And also, it had terrible things in it. Nothing was refined. It was using bad quality water and everything. So, I mean, granted, they probably weren't getting dysentery because there was so much alcohol that it was clearing everything out. The idea that they were probably drinking an ounce and a half or even 2 ounces of that kind of gin back then probably was a lot stronger.
Hmm. So the 1915 quality of gin,
I wonder about champagne too. I wonder about because
quality of sparkling. Okay.
well, and the alcohol content. Because again, back then they had to make things higher alcohol content. We didn't have refrigeration at the same rate that we do now.
Oh, right.
Shipping didn't happen overnight, or it happened within days. India Pale Ale was created for that very reason, because they were trying to fortify beer with more alcohol and more flavors so that it would make its way across the expanses of ocean through the spice trade to India. As far as British colonists go, that's how they created things like that. So everything had a lot more alcohol back then. So I wouldn't be shocked if the champagne did as well. And maybe there was no actual way of testing it back then either. So they could have, who knows what your alcohol content could have been on your champagne, and nobody was. What if it was higher than the booze itself? That'd be crazy.
Oh, wow. I thought of that. This is kind of like how old fashions today, a very popular cocktail, like kind of having a renaissance in the last several decades.
Decade for
Um,
sure.
People like someone who's trying to recreate that feeling from when it was invented 150 years ago, 200 years ago, somewhere in there. They're going to use, if you want to be really authentic, rye, because it's going to be rougher, closer to what the bourbon they had back then. Bourbon today is much smoother because our techniques are so much better, right?
Right. and
Hmm.
and more moonshine style, so it would be harsher. I mean, literally, depending on whatever anybody could get their hands on, especially Jerry Thomas out in California trying to create the kind of father of modern gregarious bartending
Yeah, yeah.
in the early times. um, a fantastic sounding character. But his measurements from some of his cocktail books are talking about a wine glass full of things. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean a wine glass like this? like like using instead of a Nick and Nora. This is
Measured in a wine glass. Yeah,
right.
wow.
This would be what I would expect, because this was about the size of wine glasses back then, or a little bit smaller, closer to absinthe glasses. Um, but look at the wine glasses we have today that technically hold 18 ounces. That we never fill up that high, but let's be honest, they right like.
Hmm.
But they were
Yep.
talking about using a whole wine glass, so who knows where they were, and if they were going to do the old fashioned, like we said, or a cocktail in itself. John brought up a great point. The old fashioned is the original cocktail, and a cocktail in itself is bitters, sugar, spirit, and ice, which is why our old fashioned is our old fashioned. But if you were going to do it, not sure, well, you wouldn't be able to get your hands on the bitters that existed back then, in Jerry Thomas's time. We can get things close, and they've been trying to do molecular analyzation on some old bottles to try and recreate abbots and different things like that. Um, but you'd have that. You'd be using raw sugar, ice that probably had its own fun flavor to it, because there weren't a lot of ways to keep ice. They weren't refrigerators or freezers. They used uh, like ice cabinets to try and keep stuff going with a big block of ice. And then John's right, really harsh rye whiskey, and then you'd probably be using a block of Demerara kind of sugar. Nothing refined like it is nowadays.
Hmm.